now to try and be sober scholars and critique the more popular scholarship that was trying to win over the people's thinking, but was not actually based in any decent scholarship whatsoever. And we have to blame the German scholars for that, for being too esoteric. And so we're going to jump a few pages now, because he goes into Renan and he goes into a few other scholars, and we'll get into some of the meat. It seems to me, he says, that this duty has been by no means faithfully enough met for the first three so-called synoptic gospels, and still less for that of John, whose want of authenticity has been inscribed in flaming letters upon the banners of the negative school. The writer of these lines imposes upon himself the task of trying to throw some light upon the issue of the evangelical documents. Although in preparing the work not of special students, but cultivated Christians generally, it may not be possible to enter so exhaustively into the subject as under the circumstances might be desirable. We can make as our starting point the unquestioned fact that in the last decade of the 2nd century our four Gospels were known and acknowledged in all portions of the Church. Here we get into some meat now. Irenaeus from 177 on, Bishop of Lyons, where the first Christian church of Gaul was established, wrote a great work in the last decades of the 2nd century, directed the early heresies, the Gnostic, and on every page made use of the Gospels. Now this fact, this is me now, not Tischendorf, this fact alone is absolutely devastating to people like Bart Ehrman and modern textual critics and modern conspiracy theories about the New Testament. End of quote. That was just, let's get back to Tischendorf. Irenaeus on every page made use of the Gospel, providing himself from them with material to overthrow a system which was threatening to destroy the doctrines of the Church. The number of passages where he has recourse to the Gospels is about 400, and about 80 of these contain quotations from the Gospel of John. I mean, to me, this is me again, to me this is absolutely devastating to any critic of the New Testament. Because what it tells you is the four Gospels were early historical material. When you compare this historical material to, say, the life of Caesar or to the life of Cleopatra or whatever, this is astounding, because it's telling you that these sources go back early on. Now, one perceptive atheist said, what do you mean by early? Well, early can mean within 50 years of the event. It can mean 100 years of the event. Whether it be 50 years or 100, it's still compared in the ancient history and ancient literature. It's vastly superior to any ancient literature when it comes to historical information. He says, from the closing decades of the 2nd century on, the able and learned Tertullian lived and labored at Carthage in Africa, and in his numerous writings there exist hundreds of citations from the text of the Gospels. Again, this is me, devastating to Bart Ehrman and modern scholars today who would attack the veracity of the New Testament, which, back to Tischendorf, which he made use of as his most decisive authorities. The same is true of Clemens and the celebrated teacher in the school of the Catacombs at Alexandria about the end of the 2nd century. Nor must I fail to allude to a catalogue generally known by the name of its discoverer, the ancient scholar Muratori, of all the books which were regarded as canonical in the very earliest times. This work was probably prepared at Rome and shortly after the time of the Roman Bishop Pius II. Some were between 160 to 170 AD. In this catalogue of books, thus reckoned as comprising the New Testament, the four Gospels are at the head. It is true the first few lines, which relate to Matthew and Mark, have been lost, but at the close of the still extant words respecting the later, the Gospel of Luke is spoken of as the third and that of John as the fourth, enabling us to see that even in the very earliest days the order was followed with which we are so familiar. I have thus summoned the witness from Gaul, from Proconsular Africa, the present Algiers, from Alexandria, and from Rome. Two others can be cited fitly here, although one of them goes back to the remoter date. End of Tischendorf. I'll carry on in a minute. Here's an important point that the textual critics, Bart Ehrman, and many scholars fail to see, and the critics. Notice that Tischendorf is showing that we have a bishop from Gaul, a leader from Africa, a leader from Alexandria, and from Rome. Different parts of the ancient world believing in the Gospels as written by the writers who wrote them. That is a highly significant fact. What that tells you, if that's happening in the 2nd century, what that clearly tells you, and skeptics do not fathom this out, and you need to understand that if the gospel has spread in the 2nd century so wide and was so well known in the 2nd century, it clearly shows you that these are going back to the 1st century. And not only going back to the 1st century, but they are intricately connected to the historical. Here's a quote. Here's a very important point. The historical oral tradition of the Gospels. Now, notice I didn't say oral tradition, I said historical tradition. Very important distinction there. James Dunn has made that distinction, and it's a very important distinction, because in the ancient church, in the gospel writers of the Gospels, there were 2 types of oral tradition. Just a parenthesis, oral tradition, you have to look at it in it's culturally specific. That's another issue that a lot of skeptics fail to realize. Each culture has a different aspect, a different way of passing on its oral traditions, and so they are culturally specific. And within the time of the Gospels, there were 2 types of oral tradition. The one where you passed it on by mouth, and what we would call historical oral tradition. That is, individual people who were seen as important in collecting the historical information of the past and passing it on, either by writing or by verbal passing it on. So what the whole point is that what Tischendorf has noted here, which is very important, is that the Gospels were already well known in the 2nd century in Gaul, Africa, Alexandria, and Rome, which tells you they are 1st century documents, which tells you that they have been carefully preserved with coming from historical oral tradition. Okay, let's get back to Tischendorf. If you want more information on that, go and listen to James Dunn's lectures on oral tradition. So Tischendorf says 2 others can be cited fitly here, although one of them goes back to remoter date. I mean, the 2 oldest translations of the Greek text used by the apostles themselves. One of these is the Syriac version and bears the name of Piscido, and the other is the Latin version known under the title Itala. Both of them give the 4 Gospels their place. The canonical acceptance of all 4 must unquestionably be general, as we see that they were transferred openly and as a whole in the language of the newly converted Christians, the Latinus and Syrians. The Syriac translation, which takes us to the neighborhood of the Euphrates, is almost universally assigned to the end of the 2nd century, and although positive proofs are wanting in support of this date, yet we are not without good grounds for accepting it. The Latin version, on the contrary, had begun to gain general recognition even before the end of the 2nd century, for both Tertullian in his quotations from Irenaeus and the Latin translator of Irenaeus' great work against heresy, writing about the end of the 2nd century, make use of the text of the Itala. This, of course, implies that Latin translation was made some years before the close of the 2nd century. I shall have occasion subsequently to allude again to the striking fact that it was necessary to translate the Gospels into Latin and Syriac as early as the 2nd half of the 2nd century, and that the number of documents was limited to the 4 with which we are now familiar. Looking a little more closely into the testimony of the 2 great fathers, Irenaeus and Tertullian, we have to ask, can their evidence be so limited in its application as only to prove that the 4 Gospels were fully accepted in their day? Irenaeus not merely invests these documents with entire authority in the citations which he makes to overthrow the Gnostic heretics. It even appears in his work that the Gospels, or rather to use his own expression, the fourfoldness of the Gospel, has been conformed to the analogy of the 4 quarters of the globe, the 4 chief winds, the 4 faces of the cherubim. He asserts that the 4 Gospels are the 4 pillars on which the Church rests, as it covers the whole earth, and in the number of 4 recognized a special token of the Creator's wisdom. In such a representation, Is such a representation compatible with the facts that at the time of Irenaeus the four Gospels first began to be accepted, or that an attempt was then being made to append a fourth and newer one to the three older ones then current? Is it not much more credible that the acceptance of all the four was then of so long standing and so thoroughly complete that the Bishop of Lyons could allude to the fourfoldness of the Gospel as a thing universally recognized, and in consequence of this very recognition speak of it as a thing which harmonizes with great and unchanging cosmical relations? Irenaeus died in the second year after the close of the 2nd century, but in his youth he had sat at the feet of the venerable Polycarp, who had been a disciple of John the Evangelist, and had been acquainted with many eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. In mentioning this fact, Irenaeus alludes very tenderly to the statement of his teacher Polycarp, that all that he had heard from the lips of John and other disciples of Jesus coincided fully with the written account. Yet let us hear his own words, and given in a letter to Florinus: I saw you while I was yet a youth in Lower Asia with Polycarp, when you were living in the scenes of princely splendor, and when you were striving to gain the approval of Polycarp. What took place then is fresher in my memory than what has occurred more recently. What we took in our youth grows up, as it were, with us, and is incorporated in us, and as such even now bring back to mind just the place where the good Polycarp used to sit, when he talked to us, how he looked as he came in and as he went out, and how as he lived, how he used to speak to the people, how he used to allude to his intercourse with John and repeat the words of the others who had seen the Lord, or how he used to recount what he had heard from their own lips about the miracles and the teachings of the Lord, and all in full accordance with the written narrative. Thus writes Irenaeus respecting his intercourse with Polycarp, and respecting the communication of Polycarp. The date of the young Irenaeus' intercourse with the agreed saint must be set approximately at about the year 150 AD. Irenaeus died in 202 AD, according to old accounts, a martyr, while Polycarp perished at the stake in 165 AD, after having, quote, to use his own expression, quote, served the Lord 86 years, end of quote. As it to be believed that Irenaeus never heard from his teacher, whose communications respecting John he expressively refers to, one word regarding the Gospel of John? Indisputably, one part of Polycarp's testimony relative to John's Gospel carries us back to John himself. Just having a little rest here for a second. But Polycarp's evidence respecting the work of his teacher must be based upon the testimony of his teacher. The case becomes all the more clear the more closely we look into it on the adversary's side and range ourselves with those who deny the validity of John's Gospel. According to this view, Polycarp, although saying so much to Irenaeus regarding John, did not drop a word regarding the Gospel of John. But supposing he did not, is it credible that Irenaeus fully accepted that Gospel, that work which seemed to be the noblest gift of John to Christianity, the report of an eyewitness respecting the life, death, and resurrection of the Saviour of the world, as a Gospel which ran directly countered the testimony of the three other evangelists? Would not the very circumstances that Polycarp made no mention of it have convinced Irenaeus of its want of authenticity? And yet it is asserted